So my name is Samar Maqusi. First of all, thank you so much for joining. I know it's Good Friday, so I'll try to maintain the goodness of this Friday with a very complicated topic like this. But I graduated from Texas Tech in 2001 with a Master's of Architecture. And then I went on to do some work and then decided I needed to look into the larger scale of urbanity. And that's when I did my Master's of Urban Design in the University of Michigan. And then I was very interested to delve into topics of humanitarian architecture and conflict architecture. And this is when I decided I needed to go back to the Middle East, where I come from. And just to note, I am a Palestinian who has resided in Jordan because I come from a family that are refugees and had to move from Palestine to one of the areas where the camps are located. And obviously this is clear maybe why I'm quite invested and interested in this topic. So I'll try to keep this brief and simple and clear. I know it's a bit of a new topic and some of you are probably unfamiliar with it, and this is okay because this is going to be a presentation about architecture and space and not necessarily about politics. But since we cannot necessarily disjoin them, we will have an overlap. So this presentation, and if my voice gets slow, please just let me know, I'll raise it. But this presentation will discuss a part of the research I'm conducting for my PhD at the Bartlett School of Architecture, UCL, and in which I'm investigating the political inside the Palestine camp and what form it takes spatially in different host governments. My research aims to unravel the impact that such governmental decisions and political practices have had on the physical form of the camp spaces, looking in particular at the latter's vulnerability with a focus on two camp spaces, Baqa camp in Jordan, which we will talk about, and Burj al-Barajni camp in Lebanon. It will also present an intervention project conducted last summer in Baqa camp in Jordan, and which was based on research findings and takes the form of a spatial experimentation. So this presentation is not meant to narrate or historicize the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Rather, this presentation is about space. Therefore, I will not indulge in the historical background or the evolution of the Palestinian problem, but I would briefly say the following. This is a conflict about space, unfolded in space and remains to be very spatial, defined and redefined through spatial practices of exclusion, confinement, and movement control. And as shown in these maps in front of you, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict clearly demonstrates itself through a long process of spatial transfer in which more than 1 million Palestinian refugees were forced to leave their homes. And just to briefly show, I could explain, this is historic Palestine, and this is, as we term it, the initial presence of the Israelis on Palestinian land. This is the United Nations partition plan, where it was suggested to divide the land between the Israelis and the Palestinians. But in 1948, the Palestinian-Israeli war occurred, and this is the reality on the ground after 1948. Unfortunately, since it's a continuous occupation, which keeps practicing the building of settlements and the grabbing of more land, this is the reality on the ground today, and as we speak, the white is decreasing because settlements are continuing to be built even though they are illegal settlements. So I'll talk about something which I term the other Palestinian space. And the other Palestinian space are the 58 camps, refugee camps spread throughout the Near East in neighboring host countries, including Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, West Bank, and Gaza. So after the Palestinian refugees were forced to leave their homeland, they had to move to areas of security, in a way, by foot. There was absolutely no transportation or any organization. It was just a very chaotic period. And obviously the closest areas to move from Palestine would be the surrounding areas in which we call the Near East. So this presentation will focus on the spatial evolution of the Palestinian camp in host countries, mainly in Jordan and Lebanon, which are my fields of investigation for my PhD, It will address the spatial as one of politics, or more precisely, as creating politics, through space making embodied in the act of spatial violations, and which I will obviously discuss. This shows the typical inception of a Palestinian refugee camp. First, as scattered tents on a plot of land under UNRWA's disposal. UNRWA is the UN agency for Palestine refugees, so I'll be mentioning it more. So it's the agency responsible to service the 58 camps. And it was created specifically for Palestine refugees. And some of you probably know UNHCR, which is the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. And that's the United Nations organization that deals with everyone else outside of the Palestinians. So the Palestinians have a specific organization within the UN to address them. So the camps would start as scattered tents on a land that usually is under the disposal of UNRWA, the UN. So each family would get a tent and they would assemble it sort of organically on the land. Tents would slowly start to change material into mud rooms to combat the hard climates. But in 1955, UNRWA, which services the camps, began constructing shelters, and in 1962, a policy revision of self-support permitted the construction of shelters in concrete cinder block shelters in the camp with the condition of retaining a zinc roof. And you could probably see sort of, these are either cinder block, cement cinder blocks or mud, but the roofs will always be retained as zinc as a rule. And the reason being is that at that time, the politics of the problem, people really thought they were going to be there for maximum a year or two and then return to their homeland. So the UN did not want to put any permanent roof material, and that way they would discourage people from building vertically. And at the same time, since this is a very fragile environment, if there are any let's say climate conditions, or more importantly, any conflict, the destruction of a zinc roof is much easier to mitigate than to preserve life than the destruction of a cement roof. But it's very important to think about these materials because it's not only an idea of how one material performs and the other. It's really a very political decision. Nothing happens in the UN without politics and calculations towards politics. So this is the same camp, and you've been seeing just the evolution spatially of the camp. But today, and after 64 years of exclusion in refugee camps, these spaces became highly dense and somewhat of independent urban enclaves. This was facilitated through continuous production of space, predominantly built and funded by the refugees, and enabled by acts of spatial violations, which I will explain in the next slide. From the onset, these sites, the refugee camps, were perceived as relief sites by the UN, with the goal of resettlement, and as resistance sites for Palestinian refugees, with the goal of returning to their homeland. Resistance is not a static notion, but a very active and operational one. So this diagram shows a mapping of the spatial stages in which the camp developed into and which produced the political scale of what the camp looks like today. So to look a bit more closely at these, as I mentioned, spatially camps started as scattered tents, but then in the 50s, since there was no political solution to the problem, UNRWA would request that all refugees dismantle their tents and themselves assemble a 12-meter square room within a 100-meter square plot of land. There will be no amenities or water services. Those will be collective points. Now, this is what I would term the relief scale. And this took place within a framework of self-support, which was meant to make refugees self-dependent and no longer in need of aid. This plot is the area, this one plot is the area granted as personal right of use to each refugee family. Now, right of use is a term that the UN uses, and it's supposed to mean that you have the right to use this plot for your means, but you do not own it. So even if you live in this plot for 1,000 years, it's still going to remain a right of use. It's not owned. Anything beyond this, anything built beyond this 100 meters square of right of use would be considered a spatial violation and authorized for removal. This standardized spatial layout was meant to house the tens of thousands of refugees with optimum efficiency and cost, yet ensure that UNRWA personnel, and more importantly, that the host governments, would enjoy fairly easy control and surveillance over the site. And I think, if you can imagine how to lay out even a city, grids are very efficient in terms of resources and cost of how to lay out a city, but more importantly, and when it comes to spaces of conflict, a clear grid, allows you to easily control and have oversight and surveillance of these spaces. In the 60s and 70s, you begin to see refugee families with plots located at ends encroach into the land. So what they would do is, you can see in this image, is they would start building a wall, but sort of encroach into the land and go beyond the 100 meters square. And so this is sort of the first, I think, practice of spatial violations. So anything in yellow is a spatial violation and is authorized to be removed. The other plots, mainly the ones in the middle, as they could not encroach like the previous ones, would start to encroach horizontally onto the public space by building thresholds. And you can see an image here of what a threshold looks like. These thresholds serve as public spaces for each family unit, and for many, it's a social public space on a larger scale. In the 80s and 90s, and when pretty much horizontally it's been completely saturated with concrete, what the refugees would do is they would start to encroach vertically. And the way they would do that is they would utilize it through using or installing external stairs, but which are constructed out of temporary materials, such as prefabricated metal. And this is very typical of how vertical encroachments happen. So this is actually just the metal stairs, which you pretty much just nail to the wall. But it gives you that vertical axis, and you can start building into the vertical sphere. And as time moves on, or as time just keeps going, what they would do is they would start slowly to morph this metal, into concrete. And this is really where I think it truly starts marking the territory. In yellow is what we see today. The Palestinian campus space and the Palestinians as refugees remain in a relationship that is co-constitutive. Yet, and due to the act of spatial violations, which is informal and fragile in status, this relationship stays in flux and continuously rescales itself proportionally to disputes of inhabitation and political refuge within the host governments. So this is an image of Burj al-Barajna camp in Lebanon, but because of these acts of spatial violations, and which started going vertically into a different sphere, you actually start having physical and building relationships just as that, where buildings, literally intersect. So the question for me has always been, how can a space of refuge and for refuge turn from this, which is the relief scale, to that, which is the political scale? So this is Burj al-Barajna in 1950, and this is a photo I've taken in 2014. The spatial deviation from the relief scale embodied in spatial violations is the actual disruption to that relief scale, planned as a spatial conduct of organization, surveillance, and control of the camp space. So as soon as the refugee decided that he will or she will refuse that boundary of the 100-meter square, which is the relief scale, is when he has asserted, or she has asserted as a refugee, the refusal of humanitarian standards and measurements. With every act of spatial violation, there's an act of political instrumentalization happening at the same time. For as soon as the relief scale is relegated, it becomes a Palestinian one, and more importantly, a political one. And I'm going to give two very quick examples where I illustrate how the scale that was produced by spatial violations, which I call the political scale, has been utilized and operated within scenarios of conflict in the camp. In this example, this is a diagram which shows a scenario that has occurred in Burj al-Barajneh camp in Lebanon. Between May 1985 and July 1988, the War of the Camps took place in Lebanon, in Burj al-Barajneh, and other camps. But Burj al-Barajneh camp was under siege for 6 months, where no one was allowed to go out. So you can imagine for 6 months, you had to pretty much rely on resources inside the camp, which probably ran out the first month. And during those 6 months, it was a very violent conflict which took place between the Ahmad Shia militia, who are in a Lebanese faction, and the Palestinian refugees. And let me just explain what the refugees did. So there was a very violent conflict happening, armed conflict. And what the refugees did in Burj al-Barajneh, since they're involved in this fighting, is they actually assembled a very, very smart network of axes in the camp to where they avoided moving on the ground. So in war tactics, it's usually advised that, and actually this is what happens, you usually avoid being on the ground because then you're very vulnerable to any attacks or bombs that will be hitting the area. So what people would do, or during fights, armies would do, is either they would dig tunnels, and this is what you call shelters, or what happened in Burj al-Barajneh, which I think is absolutely fascinating, because of the proximity of the buildings and because of this scale that has been produced, they would make openings in the walls. So let's say these are two buildings across from each other. This is a building and that's a building. They'll make an opening here and an opening there, two buildings crossing each other, and then they would connect it with a slab. And they would keep doing this throughout the camp. So they were able to do this on 3 different levels, and they were able to connect more than 400 shelters and create pretty much a radial axis throughout the camp. And they did not have to set foot on the ground, which obviously gave them a very strong advantage during the armed struggle. Another example, so that was Burj al-Barajneh camp in Lebanon. The other one is Baqa camp in Jordan. And these are the 2 camps I'm investigating. So the second example is a bit different, but the Jordanian government has been adopting a mode of rescaling the Palestinian camps in Jordan by opening, through widening existing streets, axes that cross the camp through its middle, and thus dividing the camp into 2 separate areas, creating a matrix of roads scaled to a new scale which allows for the quick entry of police and gendarme tanks into the very tissue of the camp. And I think here I have to explain a concept which you guys are familiar with called collective punishment. But the reason this happens and the reason space and practices of spatial production or rescaling happens in a camp at the scale is because if there is unrest in a camp, the whole camp is under siege and the whole camp is confined and the whole camp is actually sort of paying a price for that unrest. So you're never an individual shelter in a camp. It's always practiced on a collective scale. So if the gendarmes or the government want to enter the Baqa camp, they would enter it in pursuit of collective punishment and not in pursuit of an individual or a family or a few people who have probably caused the disruption. So this idea of collective punishment resonates and has been experienced by the refugees from the onset. And I think this is why these practices, whether conducted spatial practices by the refugees or the governments, take on this shape and this scale. And now we can sort of talk about my intervention. I'm going to talk about my intervention in the summer, but first I will talk about it through 3 short films, and then we will actually get into the pictures of the intervention itself. To begin to understand the produced scale of the Palestinian camp in host governments, I embarked on a visual investigation utilizing the moving image as a tool to first juxtapose two camps to be able to contextualize both scales in their localities. So it's very obvious, I think, how movement within a scale of Baqa camp on the left and then the movement within the scale of Burj al-Barajni camp on the right are completely different. And you can just visualize especially what that would mean. And I will be showing next. So this film will illustrate what I've already explained previously, but it will actually show the way I filmed these films. Is I've used one of those GoPro cameras, and what I decided is whatever is a predominant transportation method in either camp, we installed that camera on that piece. So for instance, in Baqa camp, using bicycles is pervasive because the scale allows for it. And so we used the camera to be installed on the bicycle. So you're going to get to see a very typical mode of moving around the camp through bicycles. And then you'll be able to see another section, which is Burj al-Barajni camp, the Lebanese camp, the more dense camp, where neither cars or bicycles are really in the camp because of the scale, but instead they use scooters, which are these sort of small motorcycles. And so what we did is then I installed the camera on a scooter. So this is to give you a really contextualized idea and feeling of movement in the camp. And then, since this is showing the pathways, you're pretty much going to be able to see what spatial violations really means and what scale and rescaling of a camp truly means. Before I show this last footage, I think it was very obvious to see how the movement is completely different. In Baqa camp, it's almost a straightforward relationship with the space. While in Burj al-Barajna, as you can see, even someone who lives there had to many times either stop for others to move in or had to make decisions on the spot or retract from certain decisions. So this idea of your relationship with space becoming one that is questioning space and making decisions on the spot is what I'm interested in, because in areas that are so political during conflict, this is pretty much what you're facing, is you have to start making decisions on the spot about how you behave in space. This last little footage is a new experimentation I'm doing, which is trying to reenact scenarios of conflict that happen inside camps. So this is in Baqa camp. And as I mentioned, the idea of collective punishment is really an operative one. So I've been told that when the gendarmes penetrate the camp and start chasing the refugees to collect them for punishment, regardless of identity, because obviously they don't really know who they're chasing. They just know they're chasing a refugee. The refugees try to choose areas in Baqa camp that are a bit narrow and resemble what we've seen in Burj al-Barajna. And the reason being is when you're a foreigner to that space and you're moving around, when you come in contact with a scale that is not clear and doesn't have a clear visual viewshed, you're not going to be able to obviously move around the same as someone who inhabits that space. It would be great to get a gendarme actually and put that camera on his face, but I had to use 2 refugee kids that live in the camp and ask them to actually just reenact that scenario of the chase very quickly. So he's approaching an area where scale has actually been quite redefined. But that moment where he enters that area is a moment of spatial advantage to the refugee who knows the space. And I think you'll be able to see it just one more time. You even lose sight of actually who you're chasing at that moment. Yeah, they were very tired at the end of this film. I didn't ask them to go a 3rd round. It was too much. So now I'll come to the last section of this presentation, which will talk about the spatial installation that I did last summer. So the idea of the spatial installation was to actually try to bring these 2 spatial scales that are produced in 2 different host governments together to reveal how being in a refugee camp in one host government is completely different to the other, because refugee camps, even though they are the responsibility of the United Nations, once they are located in a governmental space, whether it's Jordan or a host country, the host government also practices their own policies and politics and regulations over the space. And this is really a direct result spatially in the camp. And this is why we have 2 completely different camp scales and camp spatialities. So the idea of the installation is merging by superimposing 2 camp scales from 2 different host countries. Baqa camp in Jordan, which you see in yellow here, that's 1 scale. And Burj al-Barajna camp in Lebanon, this scale. To produce a hybrid third, one which can produce new relations of social and political relevance and which have the potential, irrespective of its scale, to proliferate into a new order of power relations. So this image shows the sectional overlap of the 2 camp scales. Baqa camp is embodied in this roof, which is and happens to be the 100-meter square plot which we talked about. That was what you were entitled as a right of use space. And Burj al-Barajne embodied and reproduced as a spatial installation. And you can sort of see the reproduced scale as tape. And now you're going to see how it evolves into an installation. So the building process, involving a large number of volunteers, was negotiated within camp assemblages, operating and reforming within a speciality of producing space and questioning it at the same time. The installation tries to produce an alternative mode for the transfer of spatial knowledge by superimposing two spatial scales, concealing some areas on the ground cement and uncovering others, reshaping the space into a new hybrid third scale, which contains the potential for creation. Now, trying to also mimic some spatial qualities from Burj al-Barajne. As you walk around the new scale, you're able to look through windows and ponder through several archival films about Palestinian refugee camps, projected on opposite concrete buildings, utilizing the proximity of concrete and scale in the surrounding area, thus engaging in another superimposition of a different material. So the idea is that since the public sphere and the private sphere in Burj al-Barajne are not so clearly defined as in Baqa, the idea was to try and bring this spatial quality into the installation. So by opening these windows along, you're able to actually, and in Burj al-Barajne, when you walk around, many times you're able to just look into the houses. And this actually has sort of reformed the social relationship in the camp. People don't even no longer close their doors or their windows. It just became a very different relationship between private and public. It's a third one, which we have to term. While in Baqa, it's a very clear distinction between the private and the public because of the scale that Baqa is in. The idea was to test thresholds of space and scale in Baqa camp and map power relations operating within the environment we engaged in as space and refugees. This image illustrates the transformation of space and spatial relations within a transformed scale. A scale, which was an area of 100 meters square, was rescaled, introducing a new order of occupying space and a new spatial situation to respond to. So you can see actually these two individuals are the same two individuals in this image, but this is before and after the installation has been built. And the image in a way speaks for itself. You obviously no longer are in a visual relationship, and you are in a very new relationship with your own space where you have to start negotiating a new relationship of movement and inhabiting this new space. And this just shows a sectional adaptation of Burj al-Barajne camp. So this is an image I took in Burj al-Barajne, and this is the installation. And it's just amazing how, even though it's an installation, it was very much able to produce relationships very similar to the ones I've experienced while inhabiting Burj al-Barajne camp in the summer of 2014. So let me just, before we end, in this context, I define the political in the Palestinian refugee camp as a political scale taking form through various acts of violations, ones that surpass relief limits, producing networks and assemblages so elastic that they constantly redefine the power relations inside the camp space. The political scale, constructed over years of accumulated violations of social, political, humanitarian, and economic acts inside the camp, is constantly generative of new power relations, which take the form of everyday performances that, when confronted as an autonomous organism of space and people, of assemblages and networks, is when the political scale expands and is when at its most political and most often at its most violent. Thank you. And this image shows the roof, but after destruction. So it's actually very funny how architecture is so fragile. It's an installation, but it was a very interesting moment for me to see how something that took 14 days of continuous work to build was demolished in a couple of hours, actually. But even though it's an installation, this is very much relevant in real situations, and what you guys have been seeing a lot on TV today is this, very fast destruction of concrete and space and architecture, but which has really serious ramifications on lives and on spaces and beyond that. So I hope this was quite relevant to what's happening today as well. Thanks.
Samar, where was the location of the installation?
It was in Bakka camp in Jordan, in Amman, Jordan.
In the camp itself?
In the camp itself, yeah. So the idea was to also recreate a new language of exhibitions and installations, where this is pretty much one of the first installations happening in a camp, actually. Usually what they do is, they have these exhibitions and installations in urban areas that talk about a space without people ever visiting that space. So the idea was to force people to be in that space, to be able to experience an artistic or conceptual language exhibited. So it was very important for us to remain in that space and exhibit the space within, rather than take it in a different language.
Did anybody from outside come in?
A few, but honestly, I purposefully did not promote the event because for me it was more about testing the collective interest of the camp itself. So this was really meant to be sort of an experiment of spatial transfer of spatial knowledge within camps, rather than taking it to a more global scale or urban scale. It was more about camp spaces communicating with each other. So it was very much kept localized on purpose.
I have another question.
Okay.
I'm very familiar with the subject matter because I've lived in Lebanon and my formative years were there. So my question is, did you have any sources to lead you on with work like this? Have there been role models or examples or just, work like this that has happened before to lead you on?
Well, absolutely. I mean, this is obviously emergent of my PhD research. So there is a lot of guiding philosophy that has been, guiding me. And I mean, I can mention a few, but Georgia Agamben, Michel Foucault, Guy Deleuze, Guattari. So these are philosophies, philosophers who address and talk about spaces of conflict and spaces of exception. And this is a term that Giorgio Agamben coined, so if anyone is interested in refugee camps as space and philosophy, he terms them as spaces of exception because they are outside the rule of law. So even though they're in Jordan or Lebanon, and even though refugees in Jordan do have enjoyed the citizenship of being Jordanian, in Lebanon they don't. But if you inhabit a space such as a refugee camp, you are inhabiting an exception. So as I said, for instance, the collective punishment. This is something that will not be practiced in an urban area in Jordan or in Lebanon. But when you're in a refugee camp, the rule of law is dropped and abandoned. So there is, in a way, no due process, no accountability, and it's really pretty much just about how conflict will unfold in space.
Thank you so much for the lecture. It's a topic that really piques my interest. I have a really crucial question. For all 2 scales or 3 scales or any scale, do you believe that there is a saturation point? Or have you found a way to measure the point of saturation? Example with the Kowloon walled city in Hong Kong, where it was a space of refuge. It was an ungoverned land, but it got completely demolished in the late 90s. So in terms of this spatial conflict, are the camps aware of this saturation point? What's the next step?
That's an interesting question, and I've sort of asked myself that. Well, Kowloon is a very different scenario, right? But it has very, very similar actually attributes. So for instance, in Kowloon, they also have this elevated network of axes, but in Kowloon is obviously much higher than Rajma. So I discovered there is no saturation of space. Because what's amazing about camps is they're very elastic. So every time you go back to the camp, you find something new. I went back just this summer, so it's been a year, and I've taken photographs in the same spots, and it's completely different. And it's not only about addition of space, there's a lot of times the reduction of space to make for new additions. And don't forget, camps will always remain spaces of conflict because it's a political problem. You know, they're not there because of climate difficulties or environmental issues. They're there because there is a political problem. So they're always going to be prone for conflict and violence. And what happens many times in Palestinian refugee camps is they are bombed and many times leveled. So for instance, in 2007, there is a camp called Nahr al-Bared camp in Tripoli, Lebanon. And it's actually much larger than Burj al-Barajne, and in 2007 it was completely leveled within 10 days, completely. And you had more than 50,000 refugees all of a sudden displaced. And now they're reconstructing the camp. So in a camp space, there is always a construction and reconstruction of space. So I actually think there is no possibility of space saturation. They will always invent new methods of addition and adding space. And the addition of space starts changing language. So at the beginning, they were building these spaces because they needed to house their kids when they get married. I mean, they did need space. And Arab families tend to be large. On an average, it's a 5-member family. So you cannot house 5 people in a 12-meter square room. But today, and because there's the presence of the Syrian refugees in these areas as well, a lot of times they're now building these spaces to be able to rent out. So it becomes a bit of a political economy, actually. So it changes language. It's always re-changing and redefining itself. But it always, always remains a political space until a political solution has been actually achieved that is just for everyone. And until that moment happens, this will remain a violent space. Which I believe.
I have a question in regards to a lot of the, as far as solutions are concerned. We're looking at this as a way to resolve the spatial needs of a lot of these people in terms of conflict. And I'm curious, especially in regards to your work at the original diagrams and virtual production, like the ones with the figure ground analyses and looking at the ways in which people use, you call them violations, and it was really interesting that I started questioning more so if the designing for spaces is actually for the inhabitant more so than it is the designer. I guess is a general question, because the interest in this is that if there are so many people trying to vary from the plan that was imposed for them, how effective is it? And so I guess my question in a way is, if you were to invariably try to design some kind of camp system typology for someone who's trying to leave an area of conflict, right, what kind of considerations would you take into effect? Because from what we've seen, the typologies are entirely apart. They're very different in terms of space or confinement. So just what would be some of the factors that you would take into consideration in hindsight?
This is actually a very challenging question. In fact, the UNHCR has been for the past 3 years trying to produce a document about designing new camps. So something that looks completely different from, this layout. So this is a very typical layout of a refugee camp. And because what you would have, like these empty areas are collective areas where there is large services of UN, and then they would have other nodes throughout for water and sanitation and such. So this is really what you would find in the handbook of the emergency mitigation at the UN. But what they discovered is what you're pretty much, sort of saying, is that the typology has failed itself. And the reason is not necessarily because of architecture. I think it's because of a prolonged period of a political problem. So architecture is not going to solve things. Architecture can only mitigate, empower, decrease power. It's a very, very political tool. And but it's not a tool that's going to solve human rights. But it's a tool that can enable people to be active in solving their own problems. So maybe what I would suggest is that there has to be a harsher language within the UN. For instance, if 5 years surpass and a refugee camp is still existing, there has to be some sort of convention within the UN, an urgent one, to deal with the crisis. Why do we have camps that are 67 years old? And I think for me, it's a lack of a political incentive and a lack of political address to these spaces. It's not necessarily an architecture typology. And I'll be very interested to see what UNHCR is going to come up with, but I already have a prediction. It's going to be a space that is going to be much more sustainable in terms of cost and efficiency, because this is what the UN language is about. It's not going to be a space that's going to be promoting political empowerment for refugees. If that was the interest, you wouldn't have an example of a refugee camp like the Palestinian, which are the oldest camps existing today of 67 years. But then, you know, the UN is very also smart, because it always keeps reconfirming itself as a non-political agency, and yet it's a very, very political agency. And this is coming from someone who worked within the UN. So until things are addressed in a much more honest way politically, architecture is not going to solve the problem.
Thank you for the talk. I agree totally with the point of the role of culture, English architecture. And I keep thinking about performance. Are you familiar with the work of Jeremy Deller?
Yes, a little bit.
So he's an artist. He's reading the Battle of Orgreave project, where he reenacts a coal mining strike and getting the police and the miners to be the actors in the reenactment. And at one level, it's kind of a clunky video, but in watching it, you're overwhelmed by and seeing in the faces of the people them embodying their own roles and also questioning, what the hell am I doing? You know, probably this person that's just trying to run the hill. And so I'm really interested in your project as a potential choreography of an urban theater that's not just theater, it's actually a deep political proposition. And I mean, is that, at one level, your installation is polite and it exists within that roof garden, which I respect and totally understand the viability of it. But I could also imagine another scale of adventure in trying to enact something in the camp that might activate both the people within, perhaps more so, than witnesses from outside.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting point, and you coined the term performance, which I'm starting to look into actually, because you know, these scenarios don't just happen once. They really recur. Actually, you'd be surprised how many times they recur within a year. And so they almost become an active performance, you're right. I mean, it just becomes a very, just like, you know, the kids running around, this is in a way a performance. This happens every time. They try to target areas and they know where to go. And so it is a bit of a performance act. But when I decided to do this installation, I questioned myself, what do I need to do to actually first present something clearly, but at the same time produce something new that has to do with space. And from my field experience, and I've been working in camps for 7 years, or a bit less, but I've discovered that refugees are extremely intelligent within their space in terms of producing it and performing within it. So in some ways, I did not necessarily need to reenact something, because for them it's not about it just being visible. It's an inherent, everyday performance.
Embodied, yeah.
Exactly. So for me, it was more about creating a new space of dialogue and a new space of questioning. And something which I didn't mention, because it's a long topic, that these spaces are very difficult to actually enter as a researcher. And what I've done is I've actually did a bit of a violation myself on purpose, and I've gone through sort of around the official routes. Because if I went through official routes, I would have never been able to create this. Official routes, which is pretty much going through the camp leader or the Department of Palestinian Affairs, which is operated by the government. So you have to go through governmental agencies. But then you're very, very much scrutinized, monitored and restricted. But because these spaces are exceptions, as I termed, there is so much freedom within them if you're able to understand how to enter. And the only way to do it is you have to have utmost respect for these spaces, and you have to understand that they've built these spaces. I mean, 90% of the camp has been built by refugees, not the UN. So you're entering to learn more than you're even entering to. But what you're trying to do is you're trying to create a new space for both as a researcher and as refugees. That targets.
Yeah, and that part of the story is fantastic, and I trust it's going to be a piece of dissertation.
No, absolutely. This is part of my dissertation, and in fact, what we're planning.
The story about how you.
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. My role as a researcher, and actually, I don't know if you're familiar with Michel Legier. Michel Legier is an urbanist, and he worked in camps in Africa. But his book, Managing the Undesirables, it talks about, very interesting book, talks about pretty much how he had to go through Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, but he pretty much focuses on that relationship of entering space as a researcher and then these modes of control that are practiced by governments or by agencies, because these spaces are there to conceal something. They're not there only to house refugees as a relief space. And that concealment is very much a top priority. So it's very interesting that you as a researcher have to always, sometimes you have to do violations to get to a more truthful, I guess, experience and result and data.
But on top of all of that, you're a woman entering those spaces.
Yeah.
How did you need guys with you to guard you? Did you go alone? What do you do?
Actually,
did you feel safe?
Absolutely. And I'm not saying this to make the camps look good, but entering the camp, you are seen as a suspect at the beginning, but you're not seen as a suspect in terms of try not to think of it as a very negative term, suspect. Try to position it within a space where a lot of intruders and a lot of CIA networks are playing. So in fact, I actually see this as a very positive behavior, where you're seen with suspicion at the beginning, and then you have to prove yourself in a way, of your honesty, of your truthfulness. And not many people get this. I was very lucky because I am Palestinian, don't forget this. So this already, this instantly creates a bit of a connection. And at the same time, because I did not go through the official networks, and because I really spent a long time visiting and working with the refugees and groups, and so I entered with a sort of an open arms and opened myself to a lot of scrutiny. And I was attacked by a certain group thinking I was there to resettle refugees. I was there with the propaganda. But you have to confront this, otherwise you're not going to be able to reach to the fabric. So it's not that easy, but I think perseverance and truthfulness will get you there eventually. And as a woman, it's an advantage and a disadvantage at the same time. I try to look at it as an advantage, actually, more than a disadvantage, because these spaces are quite conservative. So as a woman, I get access to a lot more. And at the same time, it could be that as a woman, you're seen as less threatening, in a way. But again, if you go there for 2 weeks and you try to do some sort of intervention and blah, 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 and you get out, you're not going to get anything, and no one is really going to invest in you. But this has been going on for 2 years, so I'm practically becoming, one of the camp presidents as well. I go around and people know me and I don't know them. But also, because as I said, this is a space where a lot of intruders come in, so an outsider is automatically singled out and seen. Everyone in a way knows everyone in the camp, regardless of how large or small they are. But yeah, I mean, the first year was much more difficult than the second year. After I built sort of networks and trust, it became a lot easier. And I have to talk about the gender aspect a bit more, but I've been avoiding it just because I didn't want to single myself out as a female, but it's true, it's a reality. And I know there were a lot of advantages for being a female in a predominantly male-operated space.
One question regarding your videos. It seemed to me that the spaces were quite empty in terms of people. Was it staged or is it like that?
No, it's just like that. I think because these videos were shot during the day, and a lot of people are obviously, mainly men, are outside the camp working. And keep in mind, these spaces are somewhat conservative. They're much more conservative than spaces you guys inhabit in the West. So the females do inhabit the interiors of the space most of the time. That's why when you see people hanging outside, it's probably going to be mostly males. And the females are really sort of they control the interior space. And the exterior space is usually controlled by men. But the emptiness of it just happens to be because of the timing of the filming. And most of the males are outside the camp working. But it was good because I was able to see all the violations sort of, on the view sheds. But it would be interesting to, I think, go back and film during the time where the camp is going to be very much occupied. It's most probably going to be in the evening.
So are there like social gathering areas, or like how do they spend their time? Or that's very interesting, kind of image to.
It's pretty much in the streets. There are no public areas. Social spaces either happen outside of the streets. The streets are not only for movement, they are for social interaction as well. A very, very important and predominant social space is also the roofs. The roofs take on sort of the private public space, but they also expand. So actually, if I don't have a photo right now, but I took a photo of Refuge, and it shows the roofs, and pretty much every roof is a living room, actually. So yeah, social space is redefined inside, but an actual public space or an actual gathering space is pretty much non-existent inside camps. So they take it upon themselves to hang out in the streets, and the roofs become sort of a social space. But it's a very, very social environment, actually. Much more social than even urban. And the scale is actually, when we think about it, like architects, it's a very sustainable scale because it creates these very intimate relationships of people and space. And it's really maximizing whatever space you have, and it takes advantage of that. Instead of just sprawling, you're having to think within a completely different space. So in urban terms, if I was to map it, this would be a very ideal, in a way, scale. Maybe not Burj Barajne, but somewhere between Baqa and Burj Barajne would be an ideal scale of urban living, actually.
Are there a lot of connection between the different groups? Are these refugees visiting other refugees in different camps? Are there connections?
That almost does not exist. So actually, this is one of the things that was very much celebrated in this installation. So many refugees and kids especially came up to me and said, "Oh, we feel like we went to Lebanon and Burj Barajne camp without actually leaving our camp." But camp movement is not that easy. For instance, in Lebanon, you cannot leave Lebanon. And if you leave your camp, you have to go through checkpoints. So people just tend to just not want to experience this, thresholds of control to be able to move. So they just stay within the camp. And even though Jordan does not have the same difficulty, but pretty much refugees retain and hang out and spend their time inside their camps. And these camps are really independent urban enclaves. You don't need to leave the camp to get any sort of amenities or resources or material you need for everyday living. Everything is inside the camp.
But men work outside of the camp.
Usually they do. A lot of them work inside, but a lot of them, and honestly what they would do is they would go to work and then they would just come back to the camp and spend their time in the camp. I cannot deny that there isn't a social stigma towards refugees in camp spaces, even in Jordan. And Lebanon, of course, it's much more heightened. But even in Jordan, most urbanites have never been inside camps, even though they're very close. And some of them even within urban areas. But a camp is just stigmatized as a place that is dangerous or a place that you enter, you could probably not exit, and which is completely false. It's a really, really completely social stigma. And, that also expands to where when refugees went to apply for jobs in Jordan, for instance, when your residence is a refugee camp, it changes the scenario, it changes the facts. And
Are these refugees allowed, and you talk about 67 here, are some of the children, are they allowed to attend school outside of the camp?
well, they have to. What happens is, so the UN agency has UN schools inside the camp, but I think they run up until junior high, so the last years of high school. This is in Jordan. You have to go to a public school, yes, but usually it's a public school right outside the camp, because you cannot go to just any public school. In Lebanon, let me just briefly say, in Lebanon, refugees do not have a citizenship, they just have a refugee card. They are forbidden to work in more than 80 professional fields. So if you're a doctor, an engineer, or a sociologist, or anything, you get a degree and you cannot work. So pretty much everyone in Lebanon has a degree and has to work in service or labor jobs. So in Lebanon, what happens is actually, the UN has created schools to where you complete your full higher education. So it just depends on the government relationship with the UN and with the refugees. In Lebanon, it's a relationship where refugees remain refugees, even if it's 1,000 years, no passports or no nationalities. In Jordan, they were given nationalities, but there are other practices of sort of, disengagement and separation towards refugees. You're allowed to leave the camp. It's not that you're not, but refugees just choose not to. They pay so much. If a lot of refugees who accumulate money do leave the camp, yes, and they build right outside the camp. This is mainly in Jordan. In Lebanon, it's a lot more difficult because you cannot own land as a Palestinian there. You can own land as an American, but as a Palestinian refugee, you cannot own land. So they're quite stuck in the refugee camp. And what happens is, even if they move in Jordan to outside the camp, they retain their original shelter and they rent it out. Because it stays in their name. Even if it's rented out or sold to another person, it stays in the original name of the refugee who inhabited it. So it's a very different entitlement to space. Yeah.
I understand at the beginning that when they got the land, they couldn't own that, so now they're allowed to own the land?
No, they cannot own the land inside the camp itself. So whatever, your shelter inside the camp is not owned, it's just a right of use. Outside the camp, in Jordan you are able to own land, in Lebanon you're not. But the ownership inside the camp does not exist. I mean, it's obviously living it day by day, it's almost like an ownership when they're building, they're investing in it. But at the end of the day, when it comes to legality, it's not an ownership, it's only a right of use. No matter how high the building goes up. But that's inside the camp boundary.
That exists in many European countries also.
Yeah, you're right, you're absolutely
It
right.
might be different for America, and that's very usual.
In Europe, but you're absolutely right, yeah. It does, actually in London, I think even they have some sort of similar behavior of not
Talking about
owning.
you had an installation in London also this summer?
Well, right now we're working on rebuilding this in London, but it will obviously take a completely different language. But we're trying to reinstall this at UCL next year. So it might become a traveling exhibition, but if that's going to happen, I would have to sort of reconceptualize and reproduce the space in a different manner. Because here was a very direct relationship at two scales. Now when you go to a third space, it has to sort of be reframed. So I'm working on that right now. We'll see what happens. And what I'm going to do actually this coming summer is we're going to do similar idea of superimposition in Bush and Rajman. But obviously this is going to be completely different. It's almost like you have to put a rectangle on all of that. So that's probably what we're doing.
You have to cut out some of the walls.
Or intersect them.
Yeah.
I mean, and this is what we're probably going to be able to do. But yeah, it would be very interesting to see how you take then the Alpa scale into the Bush and Rajma scale. inside of Refuge. It would be very interesting to see.
I wonder if there is air conditioning.
inside the shelters.
Well,
There is.
Or bathrooms in the beginning.
Oh, in the beginning, there was no bathrooms. As I said, that room was with no amenities. I mean, it really was just asbestos sheets, and a zinc roof and an empty room.
Public.
And yeah, there were collective public bathrooms, as that's my mother, by the way. And she has experience with some camps. But what we would have is, let's say, every maybe 4 or 5 blocks will have a collective point of collecting water and of public bathrooms and even public showers. And in fact, this building itself was a public shower site, which the UN owned. And so this building is a spatial violation itself. So once people obviously, once they were given their plots of land, started building, the first thing they would do as an addition would be a kitchen and a bathroom. Because it's just socially and environmentally, it was very uncomfortable for the women to keep walking to these. So the first investment into space was building a kitchen and a bathroom. And, it actually happens very quickly, but within a couple of years, 3-4 years, they did not need any collective points anymore. So those were demolished.
Did you ever notice any evidence of these spatial violations that were individual, not collective, being removed by the government?
Very few. Very, very few. So the UN, UNRWA, turns a blind eye on purpose. And I even discovered there's absolutely no regulations or policies written in the UN addressing spatial violations. And it's pretty much been relegated to the host government. So right now inside the camp, if you ever see that scenario, it's not the United Nations demolishing it, it's the host government. And this is a very intense political move to give that responsibility to host government because it starts creating a very tense relationship between refugees and the host government. And this is what's been happening really.
Have you seen any animosity build up from these violations with host government whatsoever, or has it just been building and kind of letting it happen?
Oh, no, there is. And they're trying to enforce a much more stricter sort of policy inside camps. So now if you want to build anything, beyond your space, you're supposed to go through a process of applying and sort of, getting steps. But what they do now, and I need to obtain this document, but I was told this by many people, is what they do now is you have to sign a waiver form saying, I am building a spatial violation and the government is allowing me, but as soon as the government needs to remove it for the general good, it's allowed to. So this is what's happening right now in Jordan. In Lebanon, that system does not exist because the government doesn't necessarily have any control or presence inside the camps. The camps are very autonomous and very different from the Jordanian camps. So in Lebanon, obviously there's a lot more freedom of expanding and building. But what happens, what the government can do is it can prohibit the entry of material, of construction material. But they, again, find that refugees are extremely skilled and creative, so they find ways of bringing in material to keep building. But under Lebanese law, you're not supposed to bring in any material inside the camp. I think, yeah, this is it. Thank you. This was wonderful.